So the next thing we need to do is interact with our database in some way, and the thing I usually start with is the registration page. So in our web application example, we want users to be able to register an account, and if you look at my database and the users table that I have said I'm going to use, and you browse it, there's actually no data in it. I could add some in manually as an example, either with SQL or pressing the insert button here. I usually like to do that just to make sure I can test that the fields are correct and things like that. But I'm going to skip over that and just get straight into coding the registration page. So we'll create a new file, and it's going to be called register.php, obviously, and we'll set the page out ready to write some scripts. Like so. I usually like to leave some room at the top for PHP code to process what's going on in the HTML below. So web pages are made up of HTML for structure, and I'm going to use this page I'm creating now as a basis for creating other pages that make up my complete web application. So we might call this something like the Northwind shop. Obviously, the title tag specifies what appears in the tab. For example, here at the moment, localhost blah, blah, blah appears in the tab. We can specify that. So if I go to, say, register now, it's got nothing on it. And it's also, I haven't saved it, so it's not refreshed. And you can see that the tab's changed to the Northwind shop as I specified a title. The body tags specify what's in the main sort of section that appears in here on the web page, and I like to lay mine out with a number of divs with a class name. And if you don't know, the class name is for CSS typically, so you can actually style that particular class or that div. So the first one I usually use is the header. So I'll go ahead and put these in now. Then I go navbar because I want a horizontal navbar at the top of my web page. The next div will be the main content or content. And then at the bottom, we'll have a footer. This is just one of many ways to lay out a web page. Obviously, you'll have more than, or you might have more divs than this, which is absolutely fine. This is just an example you could also use. So in our main content section, this being the registration page, we obviously want a HTML form for gathering user input that we are then going to insert into the database. We might also just specify what we want the user to do on this page with a heading. And we'll say enter registration details below or something like that. We'll need a form to gather user input. We'll set the action to the current page we're on. So the PHP script that processes this form, if I leave the form action to blank, the PHP script within register.php will actually execute and process the form. I could do it on an external PHP file, but I'm not going to do that because it's much easier just to do it this way. We'll set the method to post because we want to hide the user's registration details and not use the get method, which will place them in the URL. So I'll continue building my form. We need their first name. We need to get their first name, which means we need the user to type in something. So the input type for that is text. We'll give it a name like first name, camel case, and we'll give it a placeholder as well, which I like to use that tells the user what to actually do. Enter first name. Just save. Close off our paragraph and just save and check that works. And you can see there we've got our registration form underway. We just need to do several more inputs. So we'll do surname. Quickest way is to copy and paste. Change the names, enter surname. Once again, what was the next one? Email. Name is email, enter email. The email in this case serves as the user's username. We'll do password. However, we want to set the type from text to password so that it hides the user input. Set the name to password. Tell the user to enter the password. We'll do confirm password because the user doesn't want to register with a password they didn't mean to. Set the type to password again and set the name to confirm underscore password. Sounds good. We'll tell the user to re-enter password. Delete that. We will just check and make sure we're okay. Yep, that looks pretty good. What was the last field? Check the structure of users. It is whether the user is a staff member or not. So rather than allow the user to type this in, there's only two options. So we will in fact use a drop-down list. Whoops, what's going on here? We need a paragraph to separate everything nicely. We'll say account type. We'll tell the user what to do, select their account type, and that will be based on a drop-down list. Needs a name so we can get the value later in the PHP. We'll call it staff, and that means are they a staff member or not. Close it off, and our two options are 0. So they're a student account, or they are a staff account. Some of you should know what I'm doing with the 0 and 1 here. If you don't, if they're a staff member, a 1 will be entered for this field, the staff field. If they're a student account they're registering for, then a 0 will be entered, essentially. Let's just make sure that works. Looks pretty good. And then finally, we need a method of submitting the form. We'll use a button in this case. Input type for this is submit. The name can be register. And the value that appears on the button will be register. So the text that appears on the button is register. Make sure that works and we can click it. Enter something and click it, and nothing will happen because we haven't actually told our web application to process what we've entered in the form now, which means we need some PHP to do that. So back to the top we go. And the first thing we need to do is connect to the database if we're going to interact with it. So I usually use include once. There are other options for like running the script in the database file. And we want to include what's in the database.php file, which means when our page loads, when register.php loads, everything in the database file executes, which is specified here. So we include the database file and it executes. The next thing I like to do is check whether the button's in fact been clicked. And we can do that by saying if is set $_request. What's the name of our button? It is register. And essentially, that is a method of checking whether the form's been submitted or the button's been pressed. The register button's been pressed, in other words. If it has, we want to do a whole bunch of stuff, like insert what they've entered in the HTML form into the database. But first we'll just make sure it's working so far and we'll just echo yay. just because we're celebrating that our code works so far. Whoops. Save and refresh, and we will see what happens when we press the button. It says yay. How exciting. So we want to actually get now what the user has entered into this form we've created, this HTML form, which is why these names are important. Because when we click submit or when we click register and the form actually submits and the page reloads, a whole bunch of information that's stored in the HTML form actually gets stored in a request array or variable. The first being obviously first name, if you install it. Instead of request, you can actually specify the method in the form, which in this case is post. But if you want to catch get and post requests, then just use request if you like. So that is how we get what the user has entered for first name. Oops. So we're going to assign that actually to a variable. We'll call that first name, and that is equal to what they enter. We need to do that for all of our form controls because we need variables to easily insert into our SQL statement, which we're going to need then subsequently to execute to insert data into the database. So our second one is called surname. Third is called email. And that is equal to $_request. Email. Why am I not copying and pasting? It's faster. We want to get password. Password. We want to get confirm password. It's called confirm. There it is. If you're using Sublime, it's handy because it pops, things pop up. And we also just want to get the value that is under the select list, which is called staff. We'll call that staff, and that is $_request staff. So now we've stored, or when we click register, we've stored what the user's entered in the HTML form in these variables. So I could then, when the button's pressed, echo those out by doing something like that. But I'm not going to do that because you can probably predict what's going to happen. So before we move on, we need to actually clean up the user input. If we don't do that, your web application can be open to things like SQL injection, whereby the user in the form, what's going on here? We've got data in our form. The user can enter things that could append to the end of an SQL query, which is called SQL injection. And they could do things to your database like drop the whole database, which means delete the database, or they could delete specific tables. Or in some cases, they might do something like get the whole users table to output to the screen, and that you can see includes passwords that aren't hashed or encrypted yet. Not good. First thing we're going to do is use the built-in function called strip tags. You can see there the parameter is a string. In this case, that string is what the user enters for first name. Bit of copying and pasting to do here, because anywhere the user can enter text, we don't really have control over what they enter, which is why some of the form controls like drop-down lists are handy. So we'll strip the tags off everything the user enters, but we won't do anything to this last variable because we have control over what the user enters, not the user. So what that does is it strips any HTML tags that the user might append to the input. For example, they could do something like turn the input into a heading. Not very exciting. The next thing we need to do is clean it further. We need to clean the variables further, or the user input further. And to do that, we will strip slashes using the built-in function, and again the parameter is a string. We want to strip the slashes from the first name that already has the tag stripped away from it. So we'll also strip any backslashes. We're going to do the same for all the other variables that the user has control over in terms of what they enter. And I'll demonstrate what this actually does momentarily. Again, lots of copying and pasting this part. Feel free to fast forward a little bit. Ooh, I've got password in there twice. What am I doing? I only need it once. My bad. We don't need to strip the slashes from the staff input because, again, we've got control over it. Let's have a look at what this does. To do that, we'll need to actually echo the first name that the user enters. So when the page loads, nothing. Let's enter something for, why is my email coming up? Let's enter something for first name and it echoes what the first name is. However, if we put a slash in front of it and hit register, sorry, a backslash in front of it and hit register, you can see there it removes it, which again is important for preventing things like SQL injection. The last built-in function we're going to use to clean up the user input is what is called the MySQLi real escape string function, and that escapes special characters like quotes, because if they can enter quotes again, they can run SQL potentially against your database or query your database, which you never want happening. Okay. Again, copy and paste. Our function this time is MySQLi underscore real underscore escape string. It takes two parameters this time, the first being the connection. So remember, this connection is referring to our database connection. And then the second parameter being the variable itself. All right, so we need to do that, unfortunately, for each of our inputs where the user can type something in, which is slow and tedious, but something you would definitely be expected to do in the real world as a developer, which you essentially already are. Also, while we're on that, it's probably worth noting that there's multiple ways, as I've said before, for doing this stuff. So don't assume that my way is the only way. I'm sure there's plenty of developers that would look at my code and be screaming at their screen. So that looks pretty good so far. So we need to check if the user account's taken. You can't have two people with the same email in general, but you can't have two user accounts with the same unique identifying items like the username or the email account in this case. So we actually need to write a couple of SQL queries when we're writing a registration page. The first one is to check whether the email is already taken. And our query for that will be well named for a start, but it will be select because it defines, well, it sort of identifies what the query is going to do, and it's going to select email from users, that should be capitalized, where, this should be in quotes, my bad, where the email is equal to what they're entering as the email when they register. And that should have single quotes around it. So quotes within quotes. Just on that, the reason I've put quotes on this is because that's a varchar data type. The email is a varchar data type. So it should be looking for a varchar data type. If you're using a where clause with a number, so say it was staff, which is a 0 or 1, remember, then I wouldn't need the quotes here. So we write our SQL, then we need to execute it. And we do that by going MySQLi query, and then the query we want to execute, and the connection that we're executing it on, which is again from our database file. So our query is called SQL select. And when we press register, it'll clean up the input and then run this query. But we want to do a little more than that. We want to actually check if that query returns anything, which means that according to our where clause, there is an email that matches what's in the database. So we want to say if, we want to say if MySQLi num rows of that query that we execute we can get rid of that. So we want to say if there are rows in our result from this query, then we want to tell the user that the account's taken, whoops, wrong button. If there are no rows, so this returns true or false at the moment. If there are no rows, so this MySQLi num rows returns false, then it's okay, there's not already an account. So we'll echo account already exists to the user. And we'll just make sure our page still works. Looks like it's all good. Because we haven't told that query to actually output something to the screen, except account already exists in the case that it does. In the case that the account doesn't already exist, so else if, then we want to actually create the account or execute the SQL to create or insert into the database to create the account. However, before we do that, we also need to validate the user input. And by validation, we mean, for example, the user completes the form, and we also check the passwords match, and we also check that they use an email with an @ symbol, for example. Because if we don't stop them entering whatever they want, or not entering whatever they want, then it's going to cause issues for our database. So else if will say the passwords don't match. So password is unequal to confirm password. We'll say that passwords don't match. Or rather do not match, because we're proper Englishmen. Else if, so that's to validate whether the passwords match. We also need to validate whether they've included data in all the fields. Okay, so we'll say if they've left it empty, which is a built-in function, if empty first name or empty surname or empty email. Oops, we need to say or there, 2 bars. Missed it again. Empty email or empty password. Or empty confirm password. So match them all. Then we need to echo please complete all fields or something. Because in this case, they're all required. It's worth just checking I haven't made a mistake. You can see that it's working already. So when the page first loads, obviously there's no errors because we haven't pressed register. Press the register button, which triggers all of this code, and then it triggers the echo message because all the fields aren't complete. We'll put an asterisk as well because it's cool. Counter exists. And we could do other fancy things like make this text red pretty easily, but I'll leave that up to you because I don't like covering CSS because you spend too long on it. The last one we need to check is whether they enter a valid email. We'll say else if. There's a built-in function for this, and we'll say if they haven't, filter var email, and that is filter validate email, then what's going on? Then we will echo asterisk, please enter a valid email address. And the final thing we need to do is actually insert that data. And that's our else clause, which we'll get to in a second. Right, so else, we write the SQL to insert into the database. Before we do that, I'm just going to put some comments in here so that we actually know what is going on. So feel free to skip forward while I do this. So execute code in, no, that means connect to the database. So that is executed when the user clicks register. All of this, clean up Australia Day. Clean up user input. Check account already exists. And then along here, as I said, we're validating the user input. Cool. Okay, so now as I said, we need to insert into the database. Now, it's always good, I find, to write your SQL queries in MySQL. So that way you can work out whether they actually work. Because as some of you have probably worked out, when your SQL queries don't work when you've written them in your PHP file, you don't get an error message necessarily unless you've made a syntax error in your PHP. Whereas in here, you can actually see what's happening. So let's write one. The quickest way is to press insert into, perhaps. Probably not, actually. I'm going to write it myself. Insert into, what's the table called? Users. In the fields we're inserting into are all of them, except the field that's called user ID, which is our primary key also. Because, as you guessed, the user ID is an auto increment, which means it automatically fills. So every time a new record's created, it automatically increments, which means it adds one to the existing number. The fields are first name, surname, spelled correctly, email, password, and staff. Yep. And the values we want to insert into there include what's in our HTML form, but I'm going to do some test ones now just to make sure it works. Surname, obviously, as you know. Email, tbrun at this school. Password. I don't care if you see this password, it's not my real one. And you can't get into my web application anyway. And then I'm staff name, so I'll put a 1. Okay, so these values match up to these fields. Let's run that and see if it works. All green lighted. Check our database, or browse our database now, and you can see there it's there. So that SQL query works. And you might have seen I highlighted it then because I copied it. I'm going to chuck it straight here. Put it in quotes and then fix it up in a moment. First I'm just going to delete that row because I'm going to insert that through my web application, which is way more exciting. Sql Insert is the name of our query variable because it's a good name for it. Now, instead of these values hard-coded, you guessed it, they come from here. As I said before, varchars need to be in quotes, numbers do not. So we'll copy and paste them. And we will execute the query and hopefully we'll be laughing. Staff comes from staff, which is a value of 1 or 0. So that's our query. Next step is obviously to execute it. MySQL I underscore query. Oops. And that is being run on our connection to Northwind, and the query we want to run SQL underscore insert. Like so, which means when we press register and all is well and valid, it will run this query and insert into the database. We will also just say there, echo account created. And we'll put in an exclamation mark because it's exciting for the user when they finally get to that point. Let's test it. Go to our base model of register, type it in like I did before. That's not my email account, don't look at that. Password, copy and paste. I'm a staff member. Press register, account created, magic, refresh your MySQL, and you can see there we've got an account. The reason it's user ID 2 is because second record in our database, despite me deleting the other one. I can't remember why that happens, but it's not really important. Okay. Password is plain text. That is a problem. Let's fix that. I'm going to delete this row and make it hashed password. Where am I going to do that? Doesn't really matter. According to my notes, I did it under here. So what we're going to do is set our password to a hashed password using SHA-1. Don't use MD5. It's not secure anymore because computers are too advanced because of people like Elon Musk. And we're also going to hash the confirm password using the built-in SHA-1 function, because we're comparing a hashed password to a hashed password. Oops. Essentially, hashing is jumbling up what the user input is with a mathematical formula and making it really hard to decipher. And SHA-1 is, I believe, I'm not an expert on this, I think SHA-1 is pretty hard to crack for a computer. It takes a lot of computing power because it's basically brute forcing. So let's recreate the account now with a hashed password by redoing it. Run. That's not my email account. And make sure that it works. Account created. Check our database. And you can see there the password has been hashed using SHA-1 into some gibberish, a lot longer than the password I actually entered, which you would have seen was T-Bride. Excellent. Bit more secure. The final thing you probably want to do is Actually, before that, you probably want to see whether it validates the user input. If they don't enter anything and we press register, it says, please complete all fields. If they enter data, it's not my email, but get the password as a mismatch, it says account already exists because there's an account with that email. Whoops, so the account already exists one works. Let's do an account that doesn't exist, like my second email account, with mismatched passwords, and passwords do not match. So our registration page is essentially done, except that it doesn't redirect the user when the account has been successfully created. One thing I've also noted is if the user already has an account, we want to tell them to go log in. So we'll say down here, already had an account. We'll put a link into our login page, href equals login php. That is how you write a link. Log in here. Now, you can see that they're in the wrong spot because I put it in the form. Whoops. Geniuses do make mistakes sometimes. All right, that looks pretty good. That should be an uppercase L on login because that's poor English. All right, and as I said, it needs to redirect. You can do this a few ways. The built-in function is header, and then you go location in quotes, and then the location you want to redirect to, like index or login, probably login actually. But the fancy way is to go refresh, :2, semicolon, URL equals the URL. So yeah, they want to go to login, and then close it off. And what that does is it waits 2 seconds and then redirects so they can see the message account created, which I'll demonstrate. Let's use someone else. Good old Harry Harrison. And he's H. Harrison. He's an excellent colleague. He is a staff member also. Account created, and it should redirect to a non-existent page, which you can see there. One last thing. There's always one last thing. We want to close the connection to the database. It's not good practice to leave the connection open. So we'll go MySQL li close, and that is connection we're closing. Don't leave your database connection open for pretty obvious reasons. And make sure you spell close right. Just make sure that works before we move on to creating a login page. Register. It's pretty good. Should have 2 accounts in here now. Good old Harry. Yep, there's Harry with his hash password, and he's also a staff member. Excellent. Let's go do login.php. Another one last thing I forgot to mention. You don't want a logged in user on the registration page, in my opinion. So what you'll do is just go session start to continue the session, because if they're logged in, there'll be a session that exists. So we'll continue it when they land on the register page. And we'll actually just go session _ unset, which will unset the session variables, which ideally will log them out. And that should be the end of our registration page.